Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the late start and some of the issues with the chairs. We always plan for a certain number of folks to join us and then expect that there will be some melt, but you all showed up in spite of the cold weather, so thank you all. We appreciate your support and your interest in this talk. So good afternoon. My name is Tony Ugas. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy, a joint partnership of St. Mary's College in Maryland and historic St. Mary's City. I would like to open our program by offering an example of how St. Mary's College in Maryland continues to work toward acknowledging the truth in our history. We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Yokokomiko and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partly built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. On behalf of the St. Mary's County Historical Society, the Department of History at St. Mary's College, and the Center for the Study of Democracy, which represents both the college and historic St. Mary's City, it is my honor to welcome you to the latest edition, the newest episode of Historically Speaking. We have some chairs up in the front if anyone would like to join and have a special seat. So come on up, don't be afraid.
It's not church, don't worry.
Okay. So, Historically Speaking is a collaborative endeavor of the Center for the Study of Democracy and the St. Mary's County Historical Society. It consists of public lectures by scholars and researchers that shed light on the political, social, cultural, and economic development of colonial Maryland. This collaborative endeavor between the center and the society first began in 2020, yes, in the midst of the pandemic, thanks to the work of the director, the executive director of the society and our office. We put together a series of programs that sought to shed light on some important elements of Southern Maryland history. And this partnership has flourished into one that features up to 3 programs per year. In my view, the Historically Speaking series is an effective way to stimulate dialogue and engage the curiosity of the St. Mary's citizens of St. Mary's County, but also to engage Southern Maryland as a whole, as a region, in a way that aligns with the mission of the Center for the Study of Democracy. And so I'm pleased to continue to support this programming and work with the County Historical Society to make this a reality. I'm also very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Chandra Manning. Dr. Manning is Professor of History, Director of the Georgetown Institute for Global History, and Director of the Senior Honor Seminar in History at Georgetown University. Professor Manning teaches U.S. history with a focus on the 19th century and courses on the Civil War, slavery and emancipation, President Lincoln, citizenship, the American Revolution, and the history of baseball, among many other things. She is an accomplished historian with many notable publications. Her first book, What This Cruel War Was Over, Soldiers, Slavery, and the Civil War, won the Avery O. Craven Prize awarded by the Organization of American Historians and earned several honorable mentions as well. Her second book, The Troubled Refuge, Struggling for Freedom in the Civil War, explored Civil War refugee camps, which is pertinent for today, where former slaves allied with the Union Army and altered the course of the war and of emancipation. This publication won the Jefferson Davis Prize, awarded by the American Civil War Museum for Best Book on the Civil War. This afternoon, Professor Manning will explore the issues raised in this book with a focus on Southern Maryland. Her talk is titled, "A Dangerous Time in a Perilous Place, Uneasy Alliances in Civil War Era, Southern Maryland." Before turning it over to Professor Manning, a few logistical details. So Professor Manning will come, she'll deliver her talk, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience. We'll try to give everyone an opportunity to present a question or comment, but can't guarantee that everyone will have an opportunity. But when presenting a question or comment, please try to stay on topic, please be respectful, please be civil, and be mindful of others' time and courteous. So thank you. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chandra Manning to St. Mary's College.
Thanks so much, Tony, for such a generous introduction. Thank you, Mr. Laporte, for the opportunity to be here. I thank you all for turning out. Usually you'll hear, yeah, we expect some number of people, and I think, okay, half of that are going to come. So thank you all for coming. I'm truly, truly delighted to be here in this beautiful place. Driving in earlier today, and you come around the bend, and the river is gorgeous, and it looks so peaceful. And I am going to open with a story that totally belies these peaceful surroundings. And it happened. There we go. It happened on the 20th of October in 1863. On that day, Lieutenant Eben White and two soldiers of the 7th United States Colored Troops, one was named Private John Bantam and one was named Private Benjamin Black, were following orders. Their orders were from Union General William Birney to begin recruiting black troops in Southern Maryland. Now, the men had arrived by steamer from Baltimore to the Patuxent River the previous day, and their arrival was not a surprise. Everyone had known it was coming since the 26th of September. Many formerly enslaved men in the region, or still enslaved men in the region, were eager to enlist. Slaveholders knew it was coming too. A few acquiesced in what they viewed as inevitable, and they just hoped that they would get paid by the Union Army a bounty for the enlistment of enslaved men from their plantations. But many others resisted. One who resisted was named John Henry Southern, along with his grown son, Webster. John and Webster Southern knew that there were men on their estate who wanted to enlist, and they knew who those men were. So they overpowered them, and they tied them to trees, and they kept them tied to trees for days. In the morning of the 20th of October, John Southern went into the town at Benedict, and in front of friends and neighbors, shouted, didn't hide it, shouted that if anyone tried to come and enlist on his property, that he would kill them. So when Lieutenant White and Private Bantam and Private Black arrived by boats to the southern plantation, which was called the Plains, that afternoon, they found some enslaved women and children working in the fields. White ordered Private Black and Private Bantam to put guns on their caps before they entered the property so that the guns couldn't be shot. They weren't to be ready to shoot. And White himself did not carry a firearm. Lieutenant White chatted with a few of the women and the children, and then proceeded up to the house, where John and Webster were waiting on the porch. Private John Bantam and Private Benjamin Black later gave statements about what happened. They both agreed, in separate rooms at separate times, that White said to Southern, "I heard that you have some of your servants tied up." Southern replied, "Yes, sir, I have them tied." "I want them," replied White. "You can't get them," answered Southern. White reminded Southern of the recently passed law for black recruiting in Maryland, including Southern Maryland, and he turned with Private Bantam and Private Black to begin enacting the law. They encountered a teenage boy on the grounds and asked if he would like to enlist. The boy said yes, and he joined the soldiers as they proceeded further toward the fields. Then the boy suddenly stopped, froze. And Lieutenant White said to him, "What are you doing? Come on." And the boy said, "I'm afraid my master is going to shoot me." Private Bantam at that point turned around and looked and saw John and Webster Southern coming toward them with guns. Now, Private Bantam and Private Black said to Lieutenant White, "Can we fire our weapons?" They wanted to shoot first. Lieutenant White ordered them not to. The recruiting party then proceeded. The two Southerns continued in pursuit. Private Bantam again said, "Please let us shoot our guns." Lieutenant White said no, but he turned around to face Webster and John directly. At that, John and Webster rushed toward the party with their guns. Southern demanded all the enslaved people in the fields to catch hold of Lieutenant White, and Lieutenant White said, "Don't you touch me." Southern then began cursing Lieutenant White in language I definitely won't repeat. White reminded him of the law and affirmed, "Southern, I mean you no harm, but I am here to do my business." Southern howled, "Business, hell and damnation," and a few other choice words that Bantam would not even repeat in his later statement. Webster Southern walked up to Lieben White, spit in the face, and threatened to shoot him. Now at this point, Lieutenant White is getting a little nervous, and so he took a gun from one of the two privates, from Private Black, but he didn't ready it to fire, but he was holding it. Webster said, "God damn you, I have a mind to blow you down." White warned, "You might get yourself into trouble by it." And when he said that, both John and Webster fired their rifles. Lieutenant White fell to the ground. Bantam and Black turned to run as Southern kept firing on them. One shot hit Private Bantam in the back of the head. Private Black thought Bantam was dead, so he kept running. Bantam was not dead. He was stunned and he was missing his cap. It had been blasted off. But he could see that Webster was beating Lieutenant White with the butt of his gun, and Bantam knew he had to get away. He somehow made his way to the shore of the creek, where the whole recruiting party had arrived on a ferry earlier. Black had gotten there too, thinking Bantam was dead. He and the ferryman had pushed off, sailing away for their lives, but they saw Bantam and they came back for him. They all get on the boat. The ferry ferries them across a creek, and they wait on the other side of the creek, hoping that a steamer would come by, and one did. The steamer Cecil sailed by. Bantam and Black flagged down the cabin of the steamer Cecil and said it was clear that they needed help. Well, Bantam was bleeding from the head, so when they relayed their story, the captain immediately believed that they were, in fact, in distress. He let them on board. Bantam collapsed, and then Black and the ferryman went back to retrieve the body of Lieutenant White, who was brought on board the steamer. The steamer made its way to the encampment of the 7th United States Colored Troops on the mouth of the Patuxent River. And there, Captain Lewis Weld, who was Eben White's superior officer in the 7th United States Colored Troops, was located. He questioned Bantam and Black about what had happened, and then ordered an escort on board the Cecil to accompany Lieutenant White's body to headquarters up in Baltimore. Ultimately, Eben White would be buried in his hometown of Newton, Massachusetts, and a gravestone was placed there the following year. From Baltimore, General William Birney sent telegrams for the arrest of John and Webster Southern. Meanwhile, Captain Webster leapt on a horse and rode on horseback to Point Lookout to alert sentries to try and prevent the departure of John and Henry. He wanted them arrested for murder. And he thought that they would escape to Virginia, which he was right about. They, in fact, had already escaped to Virginia. That's where they spent the rest of the war. John Southern actually rose to the rank of major in the Confederate Army. He's on Confederate Army rolls as major, although I have not yet found any battles that he fought in, but I just started looking about 2 weeks ago. So that the jury is out on that, but he is on the rolls as a major in the Confederate Army. Benjamin Black, Private Black, survived the war. He served with his unit all the way until the unit was discharged in 1666, and then he likely returned to Talbot County, Maryland, which is where he had enlisted. John Bantam did not die immediately, as Eben White did. His death was long and lingering. He ultimately expired in March of 1864 from the unhealed head wound complicated by tuberculosis. What I want to ask today is, how do we explain such shocking violence? In a state that remained part of the Union, and was not generally an active combat zone, with obvious exceptions like the Battle of Antietam, but not around here. How do we explain it, especially when we look closer to see that as dramatic as this murder was, it was no aberration. It was just a heightened, more intense expression of pervasive violence. And my answer, to cut to the chase and then I'll tell you how I got there, my answer is that this violence, I think, is best understood as the outraged and visceral response of people accustomed to power at what they perceived as a betrayal by a government that they assumed existed for their benefit and to act on their behalf. But to really understand that, we need to take a look at both the national, the state, and the local context in which this incident occurred. And so that's what I want to do. I'm going to take a look at the national, the state, and the local context in which this October 1863 event occurred. And then I want to take a very close look at what's going on right here in St. Mary's County, what's going on at Point Lookout during the war itself, and what was local response to it. The local response was violence, so how did Black Marylanders who bore the brunt of that violence withstand it? What were their strategies for survival? And then we'll wrap up by me telling you how this murder resolved, that's so you'll stick around till the end, and I will share some thoughts on memory and legacy. So that is where we are going today. All right, I will get this right, I promise. There we go. So let's start with the national context. 1863 doesn't come out of the blue. 1863 is in many ways the product of forces that have been building for a long time. The sort of predicate, the substrate that we all really need to understand for any of it to make sense is that the state of slavery was a daily low-level war, really, a daily state of low-level war between people on the one hand claiming the complete power to subject other people who obviously do not want to be subjected. The only way to do that is through the use of violence. So we have slavery is a daily low-level war. And in that daily low-level war, the power of the federal government had always been on the slaveholders' side. That was even more so in the decade before the Civil War broke out. In other words, the federal government was even more on slaveholders' side as the 1850s progressed, beginning with 1850 with the passage of a Fugitive Slave Act, which was the largest expansion of federal power up to that point on behalf of slaveholders. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the long-standing Missouri Compromise to open up territories that had once been closed to slavery. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the United States Supreme Court had said that Black people could not be citizens of the United States, despite the fact that many states did make them citizens, and at the time the state, not federal government, determined citizenship. And went further to state that a Black person had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In 1860, Senator Jefferson Davis introduced resolutions on the floor of the United States Senate that stated that the United States federal government was obligated to promote the interests of slaveholders by force if necessary, and that slavery followed the United States flag. Those resolutions did not pass the Senate, but they do speak to an expectation among slaveholders about where the power of the federal government resided. There we go, now I did it right. They speak to a certain confidence about where the power of the federal government resided, but the election of 1860 shook that confidence. For the first time in a long time, the presidency would be occupied not by a supporter but by an opponent of slavery. It would be occupied by somebody who had won office on a platform pledged to halt the westward expansion of slavery. At that, 11 states left to form a government that they were more confident would side with them. And the speech of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens really confirmed that confidence, really shored up that confidence when he stated that the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Maryland notably did not decide to join the Confederacy. the majority of Maryland voters retained confidence in the United States government as the protector of their interests. They didn't think the U.S. government would switch sides. We'll come back to that in a little bit when we get to the state context. But 11 states did make that decision, and war came. As war came, enslaved people saw things a little bit differently. They saw a possibility that, in fact, maybe the United States government would switch sides in their daily ongoing battle with slaveholders. And they acted to make that happen. On the 23rd of May in 1861, just weeks into the war, 3 men, one named Shepard Mallory, one named Frank Baker, and one named James Townsend, learned that their slaveholder was going to be shipping them south the next day to work to build Confederate fortifications. That would separate them from their families. They didn't want to be separated from their families. They didn't want to build Confederate fortifications. And they knew the Union Army was not far away, because the United States Army installation at Fort Monroe in Virginia had never fallen to the Confederacy. And so they ran to the Union Army at Fort Monroe. The next morning, their slaveholder wakes up, who was a major in the Confederate Army, and realizes they're gone, and sends an agent to Fort Monroe to demand the return of the 3 men by the terms of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Well, the agent encounters General Benjamin Butler, the charming-looking fellow over there. Now, Butler was an opportunist and a lawyer, but he was a pretty good lawyer. And Butler said to them, wait a minute, you can't say you're out of the Union, that you are in rebellion against the federal government, and then invoke the federal government's laws on your behalf. No, the Fugitive Slave Law by your own act does not apply. You're not going to return your enslaved people. And furthermore, they've told me that you were sending them to build fortifications, which you did not deny. The international laws of war allow for the confiscation of enemy property if it is being used against me in war. You have been nothing if not insistent that slaves are your property. So, by international law, I confiscate them as contraband of war. Now, he wasn't calling them property. He was making fun of slaveholders for calling them property, but he was using that. He was using that to prevent the return of these 3 men into enslavement. And word got out, and within weeks, 800 more enslaved people had made their way to Fort Monroe, which became known as Freedom's Fortress, and that phrase, contraband of war, stuck. And so freedom-seeking people who left slavery, ran to the Union Army during the war, were known as contrabands. From then on, there were a lot of them. From then on, anywhere the Union Army went, enslaved people ran to it. If a state was in the map, it probably is not super easy to see where you are. So there are 2 maps up there showing the location of some major contraband camps throughout the seat of the war. Essentially, they're all along the coast on the East Coast, and on the West Coast, or sorry, not the West Coast, in the Western theater of the war, they tend to line rivers and railroad lines, transport. That's where you usually find them. And they moved around a lot in the West. But the point is that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, more than 500,000 enslaved people ran to these locations. Now, if a state was in rebellion against the Union Army could operate on Butler's logic and was not bound by state laws where slavery was concerned, did not have the obligation to uphold slavery. And that is why more than 500,000 people ran to the Union Army over the course of the war and spent the war in these contraband camps. In these camps, men, women, and children fled slavery, but they also helped the Union win the war, end slavery, and define the meaning of citizenship in the United States. This is a story very dear to my heart, and I have told it many times. And when I was first invited here, my plan was to tell this story and just use a few local examples. But then I found that even white murder case, and I couldn't leave it alone, and I ended up starting from scratch. So instead of using state and local examples to illustrate a national context or a national story, I decided to dive really deeply into local evidence and use the state and national context to try to understand better what's going on right here. Now, you can decide at the end of this if this was a good idea or a terrible idea, and if it actually helps us to see anything differently better about the big picture story too. I don't know, I just did this. I have not shared this with anybody before, so this is an exciting world premiere. All right, that's national context. State context, how is Maryland unique? How is Maryland different? Maryland voted not to secede, remember. At least a majority of voters in Maryland retained the belief that the U.S. government would continue to side with their interests. And in at least two ways, they were right. Civil law, all civil state laws remained in effect in Maryland, and that included laws upholding slavery. So relatedly, the Army could not serve as an automatic refuge in Maryland because the state was not in rebellion and because state laws were still in effect. Now that made Maryland, even though it was in the Union, a scarier state in some ways for enslaved people than nearby Virginia was, or than Washington, D.C. for that matter, because the federal government really had control of Washington, D.C. In fact, Captain D.B. Nichols, who oversaw a contraband camp in Washington, D.C., reported that people here are very much afraid of Maryland. They were afraid of being kidnapped into Maryland, actually, and sold into slavery. And they retained those fears until the 1st of November in 1864. And by then, things had changed. In the summer of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln met with delegations from border states, Maryland and the 3 other states with slavery that remained in the Union. He met with the delegation, and he proposed a plan for compensated emancipation, saying to them, if your state legislatures will by state law outlaw slavery, federal funds will compensate slaveholders. Your state has to take the action, federal funds will compensate. They turned him down flat. But it really did kind of get the ball rolling. Well, among other things, it then inspired Lincoln to make sure to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not apply in the border states, but was bolder action than he had to that point. By late 1863, opinion had started to shift in some parts of the state of Maryland. Some parts of the state had started to link Union and emancipation in a way that they had not before. So there was a conversation in the state about whether or not to get rid of slavery. From April to September of 1864, a state convention met to debate a new state constitution with or without slavery. In October of 1864, a new constitution without slavery went to the voters, including enlisted soldiers from Maryland could vote. Their vote made the difference. It was a very close vote, but the soldiers' vote put the abolish slavery constitution over the top. And by November 1st of 1864, slavery was outlawed in Maryland. Now, around here, that opposition remained everywhere. But opposition was especially fierce here in this portion of the state. In this portion of the state, locals actually had voted for secession, so they were already not super happy with Annapolis. When this new constitution came down the line, they were doubly unhappy. Influential locals were prominently secessionists, including the buddy we started out with, Mr. John Henry Southern, who was one of the wealthiest men in the state, one of the wealthiest men in the region. What you're looking at is the slave schedule from the 1860 census showing all of the people that John Henry Southern owned in 1860. He owns dozens of enslaved people. He owns thousands of acres. Southern and a group of like-minded neighbors provided active aid to the Confederacy. From the moment so now we get to the local context, what's going on right here during the war itself. They immediately established a system of signals across the river to Virginia. They immediately began gun running to Virginia. I don't know yet where they're getting the guns, but they're running guns over to Virginia. They're also forcibly sending some of their enslaved people over to the Confederate Army to do exactly what Baker and Townsend and Mallory were going to be forced to do, which is build fortifications. So, aware that this is going on, the Union Army decides to establish a presence in southern Maryland to try and disrupt the trade between southern Maryland and Confederate Virginia. The Union Army arrives at Point Lookout in the very first year of the war in 1861. In addition to the sort of surveilling operations there, they also establish a Union Army hospital, Hammond Hospital. Nurses are present in Hammond Hospital from 1861 to 1865. They are, who the nurses are changes over time. I'm not sure where she went. There's somebody here who knows even more about that than me, wherever she went. But yeah, there she is. You can talk to her about them. But they are there in the employ of the United States government from 1861 to 1865. And enslaved people start arriving right away. They don't wait until November 1st, 1864. They start arriving in 1861. So by 1862, there is a contraband camp at Point Lookout. It is a much more precarious one than in a place that had seceded, but there is one here by 1862. There's something else here starting in 1863. After the Battle of Gettysburg, in which a number of Confederate soldiers are taken prisoner, the Union really doesn't have anywhere to put them, and so a prisoner of war camp is established here at Point Lookout. In the fall of 1863, black enlistment into the Union Army begins, and more enslaved people locally start running. That contraband camp had been there for a while, but people started running in larger and larger numbers in the fall of 63 to create an agricultural labor shortage among locals here. In the fall of 1863, the Union Army established 3 what were called government farms, farms where formerly enslaved people would work for wages to feed themselves and to support the Union Army. In the winter of 1864, a new regiment comes in to start guarding the Confederates at that POW camp. It is a regiment of black soldiers. So that's what's going on locally here on the ground. So, since it's different here, and I've told you that that things are a little bit different in Maryland, they're a little bit different locally, what does that do to the Union Army's response when freedom-seeking enslaved people show up at Point Lookout? What it does is make that response much more inconsistent. That's why it's a much bigger risk to come to Point Lookout before November 1st, 1864, than it is to go to Fort Monroe or Washington, D.C. The response will depend almost completely on who an enslaved person encounters. Which soldier do they meet first? That's probably what's going to determine what happens if an enslaved person runs to Point Lookout. But the response really fell into one of 3 categories. The first 2 were conciliatory towards slaveholders, locals, and the third was not. The first category consisted of soldiers who thought, we want Maryland to stay in the Union. We want people who live in Maryland to see Maryland as better, being in Maryland as better than being in Virginia. So that means that we have to uphold the laws of slavery in Maryland, including here at Point Lookout, to really demonstrate that it's worth your while to stay in the Union. So that's category 1. Category 2 are people who feel that the state loyalty is not what matters, it's the individual loyalty. If you're a secessionist, we're not giving you can't reclaim an enslaved person. But if you're loyal to the Union, you can, because again, they want to demonstrate it's in your interest to stick with the Union government. But there's a third category right from the beginning that says, no, this has nothing to do with a state government. This has to do with slavery is wrong, and I, as a soldier, am not going to return slaves. And I'm not going to allow a slaveholder on grounds to reclaim an enslaved person. So there's a lot of conflict within Point Lookout between those 3 potential responses. So if you're an enslaved person and you're running, what happens when you get there depends on who's on duty that day. That makes it different here. It really makes it different here. But as the war continued, more and more Union soldiers begin to realize that enslaved people fleeing from slaveholders are likely to prove more reliable allies to them than people who are running guns across to Virginia. And maybe it's in their interest actually to cultivate an alliance with people who know the local area. And so alliances, did I go too far? Yeah. Alliances begin to form. between Union Army soldiers and enslaved people. On the slide there, General Dan Sickles is in charge of the whole region early on in 1861, and he tells Congress in a sort of general way, look, the most reliable and valuable information we get is from local enslaved people. He's giving you the big picture there. I want to give you one sort of specific example of what's leading him to make these big claims. And I'm going to tell you about two local men who were enslaved by a man named Ferguson. Ferguson owned a ferry that went across a creek, and he was forcing the men to use that ferry to run supplies over to Virginia. They were leaving from Ferguson's Point, they were running supplies over to Virginia, and they were paying attention when they got over to Virginia as to what was happening with these supplies and where were they going and what was the scuttlebutt about where their troops were going next. So they come back, they're doing this back and forth, and then they make it to Sickles. They make it to Point Lookout, and they tell him that supplies are heading to Richmond, which Sickles knew, but also the Rappahannock, which Sickles had not known. And so that information about the Rappahannock in particular informed Union troop movements early in the war. That's what Sickles is talking about here. That example over and over and over again. So in return, the two men do not get forced to go back to Mr. Ferguson. Instead, they get jobs here at Point Lookout, not here, but at Point Lookout in the quartermaster department. In effect, the federal government, through the Union Army, was at least some of the time switching sides from the slaveholder side to an enslaved person's side. Increasingly, when slaveholders showed up, enlisted men began to close ranks around on the side of enslaved people. There are actually a number of very funny, well, they're funny for me now. They were not, I'm sure, for the people at the time. Very funny episodes about slaveholders showing up and wanting in at Point Lookout to search for people they claimed to own. And the soldiers, in one particular instance, I gave you a kind of boring instance here, but there's a particular instance where Sickles says to the enlisted soldiers, they're sort of surrounding a slaveholder, and Sickles said, you know, if it were something along the lines of, I know you guys would never do anything like kick this guy out of camp. And Sickles walks away, and they form a long, like, two lines on either side, and everybody gives him a kick on the backside until he is out of camp. And he is unsuccessful that day in retrieving the person he came for. The other group of people who are increasingly here are nurses, again, people in the employment of the United States government. And nurses also became, sometimes, not all of them, one named Sophronia Buckland in particular wasn't crazy about this development, but others were. Abby Hopper Gibbons and her daughter Sarah, for instance, became allies to people seeking freedom. Gibbons kept a really extensive journal. She regularly hid enslaved people and helped get them out of here and up to Washington, D.C. or to Fort Monroe. She tells one story she tells is people are in a flurry, they're looking for these two men, and they think, oh, I can't find them. They guess they must have gone away. They must have already escaped. Well, they're in her closet at the time. She just keeps her mouth shut. No one asked her. She didn't answer. That night, she mysteriously provided 2 extra rations, put them in a boat. The next day, the boat was gone. Darn. So she did that kind of thing all the time. In another instance, about a month later, she was changing into a clean dress after a day in the hospital. There was a knock on her door. She opens it up, and she says there was a man crying bitterly, and he came in, and he sat down on her floor. He lifted up his trouser leg to reveal heavy anklets and about a foot of heavy chain that had cut into his leg. The slaveholder had chained the man to a tree and then left home, forgetting that he was there, that he chained him there. So the man had somehow broke the chain, and he made his way to Point Lookout Hospital. That night, Gibbons once again got him out of Dodge. Now, it should be emphasized that these new alliances with the Union Army are uneasy and inconsistent. Again, it depended on who you got any given day. And local slaveholders still did come to try to retrieve enslaved people. Sarah Gibbons wrote to her mother when her mother was away once that Colonel Blakiston, I want you to remember that, just file that name for later. Colonel Blakiston and others came down for their slaves. One of them, catching a glimpse of his master, said, "Good God, there's the colonel," and disappeared. Soldiers didn't always side with freedom seekers. Some did not. That's one is Sarah Gibbons, the one on the right is Abby Gibbons. Abby Gibbons would get furious with Union soldiers when they didn't side with enslaved people, and she had a lot of opportunity to be furious, including the incident she tells about here, when some Union soldiers went into the contraband camp around midnight, attacked men in their tents, attacked people and families in their tents, beat several severely, and stole from them. So, allies, but not always reliable allies. And yet, despite the unreliability, there's a clear trajectory toward alliance as the war goes on. More and more, we see incidents like this one, where Lieutenant Joseph Palmer testifies that when a local man named Cox tried to come reclaim his enslaved people, the soldiers are more and more likely to, in this case, pounce on him and side with the enslaved person. As that began to happen more and more, the response among local slaveholders is to feel a real sense of betrayal. The local newspaper, the St. Mary's Gazette, complained bitterly about this trajectory of alliance that it felt was plainly visible at Point Lookout. Now that trajectory, combined with some other wartime developments, to make slaveholders feel like there is a sea change afoot and not one that we like. Two developments in particular, the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army and the appropriation of land for these government farms, really infuriated local slaveholders. As black troops remained on the Patuxent even after the murder of Eben White, a delegation of prominent locals went to Washington, D.C. to see President Lincoln to say, "Get them out of here, we don't want them." Lincoln declined. And in fact, just a few months later, in December of 1863, Lincoln visited the area. He did not go visit those local slaveholders. He did pay a visit to Point Lookout. That felt like a betrayal. Also at Point Lookout, since the summer of 1863, there had been a POW camp. Guarding the POW camp were black soldiers. Again, that felt like a reversal. That felt like, the federal government was switching sides. And the government farms amplified that sense. The rate of escaped enslaved people from St. Mary's, really, and adjoining counties too, really accelerated, got faster in 1863. So there was a labor shortage on slaveholders' farms. While the Union Army has an abundance of labor in the contraband camp, who starts to grow not for the people who once owned them, but for the use of the Union Army and for their own benefit. As you can see from this little snippet from the St. Mary's Gazette here, this really felt like an affront to local slaveholders. And yet, even as they bristled, the state of Maryland was moving against slavery. That state convention was meeting, and soldiers voted, well, everybody, but especially soldiers, voted in October of 1864 to pass the new Constitution. Local slaveholders were already mad about that Constitution passing, but they had one last hope. Lincoln had promised, or at least offered, compensated emancipation in 1862, and a slaveholder could also go to the Union Army and claim a bounty if for any number of his enslaved people who joined the Union Army. And so local slaveholders figured, well, why not for all enslaved people too? You'll pay for the ones that join the Army, maybe we can compensate it for all of the ones that we own. But they felt really betrayed when one of the loudest voices against that plan was a congressman not from the wilds of New England, but from Maryland. Henry Winter Davis went on record saying to the idea of compensated emancipation in 1864, they refused the offer when it was made, and now they may eat the bitter fruits of their own folly. Government farms, black enlistment, Henry Winter Davis. This felt, to the St. Mary's Gazette, like war was being waged upon the slaveholder. This is a 180-degree reversal. So, how do they respond? They feel betrayed. They feel betrayed, and so the response is violence. Now, it's important to note that violence is ever present in slavery. It's not like all of a sudden violence appears in 1861. Soldiers and nurses comment over and over about the old scars that people arrive with, demonstrating that beating had gone on for years and years. Life expectancy among the enslaved is notably lower, which usually indicates the presence of violence. But there was a particular fury evident in the violence visited on enslaved people as the alliance between the federal government and the formerly enslaved continued to develop. And you can see that violence in the examples on the screen here. One is from Abby Hopper Gibbons' Journal. Another one is from the Hammond Gazette, which is a newspaper at Hammond Hospital at Point Lookout. And these are not isolated examples. General Dan Sickles noted the habit of local slaveholders of waiting in the woods right outside the borders of the contraband camp for people in the camp to have to come and get firewood and simply shoot anybody who came for firewood. The examples of just gratuitous violence mount throughout the war. And so it is in that context I want us to revisit this murder that we started with. I told you we'd get back. If we look closely at this incident, I think what we're seeing is rage over betrayal. We are not seeing an impulse in the moment. This is premeditated. Southern told his friends and neighbors he was going to shoot, even white. But the language that he uses, I've got a couple of arrows pointing to some particularly choice passages, but just trust me on this one. The language that he uses just seethes with anger, with passion, with hatred. It is visceral because the expectation of a federal government siding with slaveholders was so deep-seated that its absence or its alteration had been unimaginable to him. And therefore, when it happened, it felt like a fundamental betrayal at a very deep level. Think about something you absolutely count on. Count on it so much you don't even think about it too much. Certainly something you would have a hard time imagining going away. And then think about how you would respond if it did go away. There would be a reflex almost to lash out. And that is part of what I think we see going on with Southern and his son. We also see a deep-seated, unexamined assumption that, of course, the federal government would side with slaveholders in Southern's wife, Elizabeth. She completely expected that the federal government should side with her against enslaved people, whether or not she supported the U.S. government, whether or not her husband was actually fighting on the other side. And we also see that her expectations, those expectations, were betrayed. This is a letter from Mrs. Southern to Lincoln on your left. While the Union Army looked for John and Webster Southern, the plantation, the Plains, was kept under watch so they could be arrested if they came back home. The regiment keeping watch was a United States Colored Troop regiment. So black men, many of them formerly enslaved, had authority over who came and went on her plantation, and that infuriated Mrs. Southern. So while her husband was in the Confederacy, aiding the Confederacy, Mrs. Southern wrote to the President of the United States because she expected, even then, the federal government should side with her, as she puts it in a letter, against a class to whom we have been educated to regard and treat as servants. Lincoln asked the War Department, should we ease up on her? The War Department said, no. Eventually, she and the rest of her children left the farm, and the Plains became one of those 3 government farms on which local people from the contraband camp were farming. There, oh, well, darn it. Let's try that. There, I think we have the roots of really shocking violence in this region. But how did black Marylanders respond? They bore the brunt of it. I mean, even white didn't have a good day, don't get me wrong. But black Marylanders consistently and systematically bore the brunt. So how did they respond? With a variety of strategies. First and foremost, first thing they did was look to putting their families broken by slavery back together again as a source of their strength. This happened in a number of ways. One was that children who were from the area but had been sold away tried to make their way to Point Lookout to reunite with their families. And what you see on your left is the text of a pass for one such boy who had gotten here and reconnected with a family member. It was the pass to let him go with his family member. In another instance, Abby Gibbons' diary noted one day in September of 1862 when 3 enslaved men managed to arrive to Point Lookout in a boat. They were set to work, Gibbons noted in the quartermaster department. The men were taking note of how they were treated and how others were treated in the camp. A few days later, the boat was gone, to the puzzlement of the quartermaster. But 3 days after that, the boat returned, and in the boat were the men and their wives and their babies. They brought their whole family together. So that's one strategy. A second strategy was to use local knowledge and really intimate understanding of local complexity to their advantage. So one thing that enslaved people do is strategically declare loyalty to the Union. Uncle Willoughby, for example, is an enslaved person here at Point Lookout who regularly prayed for the success of the Union Party when officers were around. He was pretty savvy about who should know what side he was on. They used local complexity when state law was still in effect, and they were afraid that they might be sent back because Maryland was still in the Union. Enslaved people would say, I'm from Virginia, I'm from Virginia. And they did this regularly. They were using local complexity. They escaped individually when expedient. But increasingly, especially starting in 1863 and moving into 1864, they begin escaping in large group escapes called, and I'm not making this up, stampedes. It's these stampedes that precipitate the labor crisis in the fall of 1863. Early September of 63, 50 people leave Anne Arundel and Calvert counties in a single night. A week later, 15 take off from Charles County. In October of 1863, 50 left in one night from St. Mary's County. That's the clipping up there. 100 left a few days later. In the following spring, the St. Mary's Gazette reported, possibly with some exaggeration, that 1,000 had left Leonardtown. I don't know if there were 1,000, but there are a lot of people running together as a strategy. The obvious strategy, of course, is for Black Marylanders to enlist in the Union Army, and thousands did. That widespread eagerness was why John Southern felt like he had to tie men up in the first place. But when not tied up, hundreds from around here did manage to enlist, and many of them joined the 7th United States Colored Troops, which served locally until March of 1864, then headed to Virginia, and from there to the Department of the South, serving from Jacksonville, Florida, up to Hilton Head. They were then moved into the Army of the James in the summer of 1864, took part in the fiercest fighting in Virginia in the summer of 1864 into the spring of 1865. They marched into Richmond in April of 1865 and then helped chase the Army of Northern Virginia to Appomattox. And they were there on the 10th of April of 1865 when Lee surrendered to Grant. After that, they were shipped out to Texas to help mop up in Texas and then remained on the Rio Grande until their enlistment was up in November of 1866. Enlistment was many things, but one of those things was a strategy for making it through this violent period intact. A couple of post-war, working on the farms, that's also a strategy, that's a little obvious. A couple of post-war strategies, and I've gone on a long time, so I'm going to give the post-war short shrift, sorry about that. Post-war strategies, as soon as people show up, they start learning to read right here at Point Lookout, and they immediately parlay that into schools in the immediate post-war. They also immediately, throughout the United States, begin gathering in what was called the Colored Convention Movement. Black Marylanders, black residents of all states, getting together in political conventions. Those don't start a few years down the road. They start immediately. This passage is about one from 1869 that took place in Baltimore. What you really want to know is, how did the murder resolve? So I will tell you. You've been very patient. The murder was reported everywhere, and I mean everywhere, except one place. Guess what did not print? Give me just wildly one newspaper that didn't ever once. Yeah, exactly. Well, I sort of, I blew my cover, but yeah, not a word about this murder appears in the St. Mary's Gazette. Within 2 days, the word has gone out from Baltimore, and within 2 days, newspapers from New York to Alexandria to Virginia, to Rutland, Vermont, to Dayton, Ohio, to Indianapolis, Indiana, to Iowa are publishing accounts of the murder of Lieutenant Eben White. They don't mention John Bantam, but they do mention Eben White. So it becomes nationwide news, except not here. Southern, as I noted, spent the war in Virginia. After the surrender, he ran to Canada. But when it became apparent that President Andrew Johnson was granting widespread amnesty, he returned to his plantation in 1866. Now, by then, the Freedmen's Bureau was in town, and murder does not have a statute of limitations. And so the Freedmen's Bureau agent appealed to the War Department and said, there is a murderer here, should we try him? And the War Department said, well, yes, but it can't be in a military court because civil courts never stopped acting in Maryland. So yes, he needs to be tried, but it needs to be in civil court. So the War Department asked the governor of Maryland to bring the case to trial. The governor of Maryland appointed a prosecutor to take the case to trial. But we got a couple of problems here. Okay, civil courts are in operation, meaning that we're going to have to operate by state law. Antebellum laws disallow black testimony against whites. And Bantam was dead anyway. No black person could serve on the jury. So that would be an all-white jury of Southern's friends and associates. Now, a vigorous prosecutor might find a way around these difficulties to engage in an actual trial. There's a prosecutor. His name is Blackistone. Anyone remember that name? Yeah, so we're probably not going to expect a super rigorous prosecution. And we didn't get one. Instead, very quickly, the jury found Southern not guilty, not because he hadn't done the murder, they knew that, but they called it a justifiable homicide. And he was let go. Nobody was ever tried for Bantam's death. Did Southern go home to live a life of quiet gratitude for getting off the hook? Yeah, no. He goes home, but he then turns around and demands reparations from the United States government for the use of his farm during the war and for all the enslaved people he had once owned who fought in the Union Army. And why did he think he deserved that? Because Maryland was a loyal state. Notice nothing about his loyalty. Everyone knew that was to the Confederacy. But because Maryland was a loyal state, pay up, U.S. government. U.S. government said no. But that did not put a dent in Southern's just conviction, which never went away, that the government should be on his side. He retained that belief literally until his last breath. You cannot make this stuff up. This guy dies in Washington, D.C. He goes up in 1893 with a few friends. There's a new administration in town, and he and his friends want a certain person appointed to a local office who will do their bidding. So they go up to Washington, and they have a meeting with the vice president and with the president scheduled. He has the meeting with the vice president. He's waiting in the lobby of the Ebbets Grill for his meeting with the president, and he had a heart attack, and he died. So literally, that's how he goes. That's what he's doing with his last breath. He has returned to his plantation, the Plains. All right, so, oh, Lord. Here we go. So how has this whole story been remembered? Well, some parts have, and some parts haven't. And we'll do a little test. How many people knew Point Lookout was here, nearby? Yeah, exactly. That part's been pretty well remembered. I've been there a couple times, most recently in August. There's nice signage there. I love visiting there. There is even a sign about the contraband camp there, which just thrills me no end. So that one we're doing all right on. How many people have heard of the United States Colored Troops? Okay, yeah, of course. That one has been pretty well remembered. There's a memorial in Lexington, not far away from here. So that one, we're doing okay. How many of you had heard of the murder of Eben White and John Bantam? Okay, a few had. By John Henry Southern. Well, Southern certainly remembered, as is his Confederate loyalty. There's his grave, and you can see a little bit of the battle standard of the Army of Northern Virginia in the corner there. But parts are repressed. If you go to Google trying to find the USCT monument, sometimes it tells you it's closed publicly. It's closed permanently to the public. I don't think that's true, but that's what Google says. And there used to be a marker to the Eben White murder, but it went missing in just the past year. So what do we make of all of this? Well, John Southern and his family and his class took for granted that the U.S. government would side with them in the daily ongoing war that was slavery, and they never stopped expecting it. When the U.S. government switched sides, they responded with fury. That fury made Southern Maryland a violent place. Eben White and John Bantam certainly bore the brunt of that violence, but more often Black Marylanders bore the fury. They coped in a number of ways. One was to forge an alliance with the Union Army, but another was to employ an array of communal strategies. Parts of the story are well remembered, parts are not. I want to end by emphasizing the importance, please, of remembering all of it. Where the violence is concerned, certainly we shouldn't glorify it. It's sort of fun to start with a story of a murder, and I thought you'd pay attention that way. But we need to be careful not to glamorize it. But we should also not suppress the honest truth about it, especially when it caused harm and it eluded accountability and it endangered the foundations of the United States. But beyond just violence, I really want to emphasize the importance of telling whole stories and of refusing to allow one part to silence any other part. I want to insist on listening to all the voices, the harmonious ones, but the discordant ones too. Because all important stories are big enough to contain many parts, even parts that are both opposite and true at the same time. Thank you. I would love to take questions.
And if you could please wait for the microphone so we can capture your question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This was just a wonderful afternoon with you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I'm interested, excuse me, these farms that you were referring to. Can you identify the locations, who the property owners were, and how long the farms functioned, and the process of returning it back to the owners, if in fact that happened?
Yes. Most of it, yes. I don't have the local knowledge, and I just discovered them to know exactly where they are, but I do know the owners' names. So someone better than me could certainly locate them. One was Southern's, the Plains. That was one of them. One was owned by a family with the last name of Forrest, and the other was a family by the name of Cox. The farms lasted through the harvest of 1865, and then people were forcibly dispersed, and the farms went back to the original owners. Southern's was the biggest. Southern's was thousands of acres. The others, I know property records to answer that question exist, but I only discovered them I literally just learned all of this stuff, so I haven't looked them up yet. But they had to have been large because one, they had to be two things: large enough for a large workforce to abandon. So the only people abandoning property were the large estate owners. So I think that they had to have been large. I'll let you can be in charge, Mr. Laporte, of deciding.
All right, I can help you with the answers.
Oh, thank you.
My great-great-grandfather's farm was in between the coal farm,
Oh, wow.
it's coal instead of Cox, and Forest Farms.
Oh, did I say Cox? I meant Cole. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
coal, right. And I will just tell you that my great-great-grandfather was an unusual gentleman in St. Mary's County. He was a Union supporter.
Wow. Great man.
And his name was Henry Jones.
Oh, well, look him up.
And he wrote the governor in 1865 complaining about, quote, "these creatures are invading my property." And I just learned a lesson, and I want to share the lesson with the group. that at the time, if you look up in a dictionary, the definition of creatures, it's speaking about God's creation. And so he was actually speaking about the slaves that were basically tearing up his fields because they didn't know the property lines and they're all starving. And so it was in more of a gracious, caring manner rather than a writer by the name of Shiflett who wrote something opposite it. Yeah. So I loved your presentation because you're showing both sides of the story. The newspaper in St. Mary's County, the Beacon, you know about that. So the federal government arrested the editor.
Yeah, he was out in 2 weeks, though.
But he couldn't publish.
Well, but he was a lawyer. He did very well. You know how he did well? He represented slaveholders getting the bounty claims for their men who enlisted. So he actually did very well off of that.
But the way you presented this to try to share both sides of the story and the difficulties of coming to a consensus, yeah, it was great. Thank you so much.
And thanks so much about that information, too. I appreciate that.
One group you didn't mention. In St. Mary's County, there were a significant number of free blacks. What role did they play in the alliances?
Yes, thank you. I did not. You're right. And I'm conscious of that. I actually just reviewed a manuscript recently, a book that will be published about the Southern free black population and their insistence on a distinction. And free was what was important about them and the importance of not eliding them. And so I'm yelling at myself the whole time because I left it out. Many of them actually worked for the Union Army and the quartermaster. They worked at the, that's one reason why Point Lookout, despite the fact that Maryland's still a slave state and the contraband camps shouldn't really be that secure, one reason why some were willing to try their luck is because a number of free black people are working there in the quartermaster department. And so the hope was to blend in with so that's what some of them do. Some just keep their heads down and hope everybody leaves them alone, which I find seems to be an entirely understandable response. And then once enlistment happens, many do enlist in the 7th USCT. Sure.
I'd like to make a comment that a big part of the history of the 1860s was played by the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set in Georgetown, and they managed the 3 farms, and they basically helped slaves reunite and with their families and broke that the former slave owners brought to court and asked the court to bind their former slaves as at no salary. Also, they basically began the paperwork to recognize the marriage of people that were living together but were not allowed to be formally married. And also the Freedmen's Bureau built 13 schools in the county to help the education of people that were now free.
You are absolutely right. There is a direct line, actually, from the soldiers who are stationed in contraband camp, the provost marshals and the commandants of contraband camps. There's a direct line from them into the Freedmen's Bureau personnel. They're often even the same person. And so you're right. That is, I had a whole section on the Freedmen's Bureau, but I realized, Chandra, this is getting ridiculously long. But so that was one of the casualties. But you're absolutely right. The Freedmen's Bureau comes into existence on the 3rd of March, 1865, and it really is a new development. It really is the first government organization whose purpose is essentially a social welfare purpose. That is another sort of spur to the feeling of betrayal among some locals, for sure, because that really felt like a side switch. But you're right, it was an enormously important presence from 1865 to 68. I think this gentleman has been waiting. Okay.
In your research, have you ever bumped into a book by a guy named Leonidas Barry called I Wouldn't Give Anything for My Journey? It's a roots-type oral history, but you'd really love it. The first 2 chapters is slavery in St. Mary's County. And one of his descendants was a slave at Deep Falls, and he took horse reins, and they said that St. Mary's was live with slave catchers, and he took, and every time he came, he'd shake his, looking for Master's horse, and he worked his way down to Point Lookout. Joined and then his whole story, they went to Hampton, they went to Texas, then he ended up in Chicago, and it's a really good story.
Leonidas Barry, you said was his name?
Leonidas Barry, I wouldn't give, and you can get it on eBay for $2, but
Thank you.
yeah, you'd like it.
I would.
He talked about a church or some kind of, they get together and catch the spirit of Reverend Allen, and that was torn down. It was a log cabin, but it was torn down in the 90s. But it was right where the guy says, so oral history, everything he said was right on the money. So anyway.
Thank you.
The delegation that went to Lincoln in 1862 from the border states and refused the offer that Lincoln had made, were they slaveholders or were they abolitionists?
They were the ones who refused the offer. They were slaveholders. They were. It was a contingent from the state legislature of each. So they were elected officials from each of the states, and they believed that they were representing the will of their state in declining the offer. They weren't so much declining the compensation; they were declining the emancipation part. They didn't think it needed to happen, and that was Henry Winter Davis's point: is, hey, you had your chance, and you said no, so you made your bed and lie in it, and that was sort of the point that he was making. But they were mostly elected from state. They were representatives from state legislatures in the 4 border states who felt like they were representing the sentiment of their voters.
Kind of surprised that the governor wouldn't have sent someone who was more sympathetic to accepting his offer.
Yeah,
Since the governor was.
You're right about that, and I hadn't thought about that. You're right. And I would need to go back and look at if the invitation was offered to the governor to send whoever you want, or if it went straight to a legislature and told the legislature to send a delegation. It might have been the latter, only because I know what Lincoln really wanted was he wanted all state legislatures to abolish slavery. He thought that would be the hardest to challenge, and it would be the longest lasting. So I think he made very few political miscalculations, but this is one. He genuinely felt like the foolproof way to get this thing done is for every state legislature to do it, which never happened. So that's why I suspect he reached out directly to state legislatures, but I'm not sure about that.
I wanted to comment a little bit about slave owners and relationships with the slaves. In my case, my grandmother, her mother was a young lady during the Civil War that grew up on a plantation in North Carolina, not in Southern Maryland. But I wanted to share with you the memoirs of some of the comments that she made. It appears that my grandmother's mother, my great-grandmother, had cited the fact that at the end of the war, the bummers, and these were renegades both from the North and the South, would raid at the plantations in the southern states, and in particular North Carolina. And what happened was all of the males were at war. So there was nobody really to protect. Maybe there was older folks, but most of the younger men were at war. They couldn't protect their families. Guess who protected my great-grandmother's plantation? The blacks. And in the memoir, about 20 years after the war, my grandmother and her older sisters came back to the plantation in Grissom, North Carolina, and they were honored by the free slaves. They happened to stay on the plantation. I mentioned this to one of my dear friends, Dr. Raspa, and his wife, Myra. A lot of people I'm sure you know. And she came up with the same story. She lived in Tennessee, and her ancestors said that there was a very, very close bond between the blacks and especially the women, because all the men were at war. So I'm not denying for a second the privation and the terrible things that went on before the war and during the war. But this, I thought, was a really nice story of how the whites and young children and the ladies were protected by the slaves, at least in my case.
There's a couple of things come to mind, and one is in any group of human beings, there's going to be an array of reactions and an array of. I simply don't think it's the case that any geographical group has a lock on good people or bad people. I just don't think that's true. And so we would expect an array, I think, of relationships and reactions. We'll also say, though, that it makes perfect sense to me that enslaved people would protect the places where they lived because their loved ones are there too. So that seemed quite logical to me. And then finally, we also, and I'm not suggesting this is the case in your family's story, but I am saying that we do know that a documentable thing that happens years after the war is when vicious violence continues to be visited on black communities in the years following Reconstruction, a survival strategy is to buy into stories that differed from the stories told at the time. I am not suggesting that happened in your case. I'm suggesting that that does happen in some cases. So I know there's a wide variety of actions. I'm positive of that because people are all very different. I think all of us should be a little bit careful about romanticizing from some examples more broadly, just at risk of underplaying the violence that did remain. That's all I would say. But thank you for that story.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
I think there's two over there.
Under your umbrella of it depends on who the officer of the day was on duty, could you comment on the story of the slave that turned in his master, Samuel Cox, up here in Charles County because he discovered his cache of weapons in the creek and thought he would be rewarded and protected?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. He does, and he turns Cox in, and he happens to hit on a day where he runs into one of the officers who is in that first category that I talked about. We have to make Maryland look better than Virginia so that Maryland will stay in the Union. And moreover, the person who really thought that was General Joseph Hooker, who is reviled for every bad thing you've heard about him is true and then some. And General Hooker was not here, but he was in command of the department. And General Hooker was really adamant on we uphold Maryland laws, and that includes the law of slavery. And so. So the officer of the day feels bad. He talks about how bad he feels about it, and he even gives the man a little bit of he says, I paid him a gratuity, is what he says, which I'm sure was, like a great comfort when Cox was beaten viciously and they didn't hand him back directly to Cox, but they did just as bad. They said, you got to leave. And naturally, Cox gets him and beats him and kills him, beats him to death. So, yeah, there are real consequences to this looks, when I line it up as, well, you could do one of three things, it looks a little bit sanitized, but that's an important reminder, and I thank you for it, that there are consequences, vicious ones sometimes, to the decisions these guys made. There was one lady in the back. Is there possibly time for one more question? Yeah, there was a lady in the back.
Hold on.
Meanwhile, I will ask you, so I said you can decide at the end, is it worthwhile to have gone from local examples to understand something nationally, to use national to understand local? Is that a worthwhile thing to do? All right, thank you.
Ep White's headstone was stolen. Where was it?
No, Eben White, not his
Eben.
headstone. His headstone is, he's buried in Massachusetts. I actually live in Massachusetts, and I didn't realize that, so I got to go find this headstone. But no, what was stolen was a historical marker. There are a series of historical markers about Camp Stanton, which was where the 7th United States Colored Troops was encamped. And there used to be one, according to the Historical Markers database, there used to be one that told the story of the murder. But it was there for years, and then last year it went missing. And I just checked in with the database again yesterday, and as of December 27th, 2024, it was confirmed permanently missing. So that's all I know. Yeah, I can't.
Tell us where it was.
So can I personally, no, because I don't know, but I can, if you give me a second, I can give you, the historical database does. So let me, do you have it? Oh, you win, thank you.
It is at the intersection of Prince Frederick Road, Maryland Route 231, and Mill Creek Road, Benedict Avenue cutoff. On the right, when traveling east on Prince Frederick Road, the marker is half a mile west. Triangular parkway at the intersection, together with another marker that commemorates the county.
What she said.
Thank you, Professor Hall. Okay, well, that concludes the presentation for tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening on this chilly, very chilly day and evening. Before we give our thanks to Professor Manning, I want to announce that we have another Historically Speaking series program in April with my good friend, Professor Chuck Holden, who's in the back. And this will be held on April 9th at the Inn at Leonardtown, time TBD, but the topic of the talk will be on Spiro Agnew and Maryland politics. So I think that would be of interest to many folks here. Professor Holden is an expert on that. And in the meantime, until April, there is a talk that we are hosting next Thursday with the Patuxent Partnership, a book presentation by Professor Colin Flint of Utah State on geopolitics and Navy power. So if you're interested in those issues, that will be next Thursday at 5 p.m. in Cole Cinema. I hope it's much warmer then as well. So with that, thank you, Professor Manning, for coming to St. Mary's, and thank you for your talk.